Listen, this is what 3,600 horsepower looks like when it grenades inside its own crankcase. A violent kinetic divorce that shattered an industrial dynasty. In 1985, the most powerful locomotive manufacturer on Earth quietly killed its newest locomotive program after just 18 months of production, and the internal reports from the Grange test floor have never been published. What did EMD see inside those engines that scared them badly enough to surrender the #1 spot they had held since 1939 and never reclaim? Shredded metal sprawls across the test bay floor, each jagged edge a frozen moment of mechanical betrayal. The block is split wide, crankcase walls peeled open like the aftermath of a shell burst. Cast into the iron, a serial stamp U645-FA8404R137 anchors the wreckage to a single winter on the Illinois assembly line. This is not rumor or legend. This is the physical artifact itself. The 16-cylinder heart of Union Pacific 3806, one of the infamous heavy block test units that ran hotter, harder, and faster than any EMD engine before it. As the April rains of 2026 wash the soot from the remaining survivors in secondary service, we look back at a spring 41 years ago when the ground shifted beneath the industry. A deep punch-through scars the lower web, connecting rod fragments fused to scorched alloy, oil channels blackened by fire. The block surface still bears the faint grid of foundry marks, the date code matching the fourth quarter of 1984 when EMD rolled the dice on 3,600 horsepower and locked their future to a single uprated design. No paperwork softens this reality. No service bulletin can erase the gouges left by catastrophic main bearing failure. The physical evidence sits in silence, daring anyone to question the official story that this was just another locomotive, just another engine, not the centerpiece of a corporate gamble that detonated in plain sight. Every fracture, every scorched edge, is a ledger entry written in steel. The only question that remains is how many others were quietly buried, their records sanitized, their defects reclassified as the company shifted the narrative from disaster to upgrade. The block is the witness. The story it tells is not just about horsepower. It is about everything that was lost the moment the crankshaft let go. The ledger tells a story the marketing brochures never dared, bound in worn covers that smell of old oil and industrial decay. The original defect logs from Grange catalog an average of 26 to 28 faults for every SD50 that left the test floor between 1983 and 1985. These are not rumors or anecdotes. Each entry is signed by the test engineer, the foreman, and the quality assurance officer. Every signature is a silent admission that something fundamental had gone wrong. Defects are coded by severity. A for immediate safety failures, B for performance issues, and C for cosmetic flaws. The A column fills with crankcase cracks and bearing pitting. The B column lists turbo lag and oil leaks. Even the C column, meant for minor errors, stretches on with misrouted harnesses and mislabeled panels. The numbers strip away any illusion of an isolated event. 523 SD50 locomotives were built worldwide, 431 for U.S. railroads alone, and each one was tracked by serial defect count and corrective action. The data preserved on microfilm and in digital scans at the University of Texas Railroad History Archive, shelf code Box 3, Folder 12, stands as a digital checksum for provenance. Every ledger page is a brick in the wall of evidence. Each defect entry a nail in the coffin of the 645F's reputation. The phrase 25 plus defects per unit is not a myth. It is a statistical reality confirmed by the ledgers and echoed in shop repair orders and field warranty claims. These ledgers are the silent guardians of the truth, holding the company to account long after the production lines fell silent. Before the first boardroom memo called for damage control, the numbers had already written the verdict. This was not a single failure, but a systemic unraveling, measured in hundreds of engines and thousands of unresolved faults. In the early 1980s, EMD's grip on North American railroads was absolute. The SD42, their 6-axle workhorse, hauled everything from coal drags to intermodal stacks, and its 3,000 horsepower engine served as the industry's gold standard for decades. But in boardrooms from Grange to Detroit, a new threat was circulating, printed in glossy color on General Electric's latest C36-7 spec sheet. General Electric, once an afterthought in the heavy locomotive market, now promised 3,600 horsepower, 6 axles, and a reliability record that crept ever closer to EMD's own. The numbers were impossible to ignore: 4,400 gallons of fuel capacity, 16 cylinders, and a continuous tractive effort that matched or beat anything EMD had on the rails. Inside EMD's headquarters, the sales brochures grew defensive. Phrases like proven reliability and unmatched service life were stacked against General Electric's bold claims of higher horsepower and lower maintenance. The board minutes from October 1979 record a single line that read, "Review of 645F development schedule and competitive positioning against General Electric's 3,600 horsepower offerings." The handwriting in the margins is tense, the stakes clear. If EMD failed to answer General Electric's challenge, the market would shift first by inches, then by miles. Pressure mounted as railroad procurement teams demanded more from every dollar spent. Union Pacific and Missouri Pacific both requested horsepower guarantees in their next orders, and General Electric's C36-7 spec sheet circulated through the EMD boardroom like a cold draft, highlighting its 3,600 horsepower output and its ability to run harder, longer, and cooler than anything EMD had fielded. The old playbook of incremental upgrades and steady, methodical improvement no longer satisfied the men with the checkbooks. EMD's leadership issued a directive: match General Electric at 3,600 horsepower, no matter the engineering risk. The legacy of dominance was now shadowed by urgency. The horsepower race was no longer a matter of pride. It was corporate survival. And in that moment, the SD50's fate was sealed, not by a single design flaw, but by the relentless pressure to outgun the competition at any cost. Contracts inked in November 1984 forced EMD's hand. The ink was barely dry on Missouri Pacific's order for 60 SD50s, each one promised at the full 3,600 horsepower, each one a bet placed at the ragged edge of the design envelope. The Grange production floor was already running at capacity, but the boardroom commitment meant there could be no retreat. The Missouri Pacific order, signed November 23, 1984, called for the heavy block 645F engines, locking the uprated design into mass production before the first field test had even cooled. Unit numbers SD50-2001 through SD50-2060 lined the build ledger, with the first completed in March 1985 and the last rolling out just before Christmas that year. 2 units never even left the line, scrapped after dynamometer testing revealed early crankshaft failures that should have stopped the entire program. The rest shipped into a waiting market, their fate sealed by the same signatures that had demanded more power faster. The corporate merger that folded Missouri Pacific into Union Pacific at the start of 1986 only deepened the commitment. On January 15, 1986, Union Pacific's capital program absorbed all 60 units, rebranding them as the Union Pacific SD50WB. The order represented $120 million in 1985 dollars, a figure that covered nearly 7% of EMD's planned 645F output for the year. Tooling for the heavy block crankcase, costing over $9 million, was amortized across this run, making a design rollback financially impossible. To admit the engine was flawed would have been to admit a $100 million mistake. Trade press announcements fanned the flames of expectation. Railway Age called it the largest single order for a 3,600 horsepower locomotive in North America, and every press release, every public statement ratcheted up the pressure to deliver on the promise. Even as defect logs piled up in the shadows of the test bay, the dice were cast. There was no pause, no contingency, and no admission of the thermal limits being breached. There was only the relentless forward motion of production lines and corporate ambition. The SD50 fleet was now a matter of public record, and the only way out was through the wreckage. Shop politics grew toxic as engineers warned of the elliptical web's structural fatigue, only to be silenced by the ticking clock of delivery deadlines. The shop floor became a pressure cooker where the quota of completed units mattered more than the longevity of the metal. Before the first engine could fail in revenue service, the project was already too big to fail on the balance sheet. The machine was secondary to the contract, and the contract demanded that EMD reclaim its crown. even if the crown was made of brittle iron and overstressed steel. Union Pacific's heavy block SD50s were meant to be the ironclad proof of EMD's horsepower gamble. Instead, they became the first casualties. The test logs for Union Pacific 3805 through 3808 read like a disaster checklist. Main bearing cracks, connecting rod bolts sheared, and turbochargers surging off design limits. Cylinder head temperatures climbed 35 degrees above the engineering ceiling, redlining the cooling system and warping the block's geometry until the tolerances simply vanished. Within weeks, the defect column swelled. A codes for catastrophic failures, B codes for crippling performance losses, and C codes for the cosmetic errors that trailed every rushed build. The numbers told a story no press release could spin. In the first quarter of 1985 alone, defect tallies for the heavy block fleet surpassed 120 entries, with over half flagged as safety critical. Crankcase fractures appeared not as outliers, but as a pattern, each one traced to the same elliptical web and overstressed fillet. Internal memos from Union Pacific's Omaha office warned of a systemic fatigue issue, language that would never reach the public. Warranty claims spiked as field crews reported metallic debris in the oil, engines seizing in the middle of a consist, and blocks splitting open under load. Every failed test and every shredded crankcase forced another engineering workaround. Governor speeds were dialed back, injector timing was shifted, and coolant pressure limits were raised. Yet, the failures kept coming, relentless and uncontained. The decision to chase 3,600 horsepower set off a chain reaction inside the 645 engine that no engineer could unwind. The uprate was not just a number on a brochure. It was an 11% surge in inertial load forced through every bearing, web, and journal by a single change, the governor set point. From the original 900 revolutions per minute baseline, the heavy block engines were pushed to 950, then fine-tuned to 954 revolutions per minute, each increment compounding stress across the crankshaft. On paper, the math was simple. In practice, it was catastrophic. Rotational forces scale with the square of speed. At 954 revolutions per minute, every revolution hammered the elliptical crank webs with forces the old circular design had never seen. Finite element models run late at night in Grange's engineering office mapped out the hotspots. Main bearing fillets glowing with simulated stress, and web roots showing spikes where the geometry narrowed. The elliptical web, meant to save weight and accommodate the interlocking jigsaw crankcase, instead became a stress concentrator. Where the old 645E's round web diffused load, the 645F's new profile focused it like a lens burning a hole through paper. Test logs from the prototypes recorded the numbers without sentiment. At full load, with the governor locked at 954 revolutions per minute, bending stress at the main journal fillet reached 210 megapascals, a 15% jump over the previous generation. The finite element models predicted fatigue life dropping from 1.2 million cycles to just under 900,000. As the bodies piled up, the urgency shifted from innovation to damage control. The first wave of countermeasures swept through shop floors and division offices as service advisories multiplied. Locomotive power assemblies were pulled and replaced with the reinforced LC-118 units wherever possible, each swap a silent attempt to buy time against the rising tide of failures. Governors were recalibrated in the field, dropping maximum engine speed from the original 954 revolutions per minute to 926, then again to 904. Each reduction quietly erased a slice of the promised horsepower, rendering the marketing brochures obsolete. Injector timing was retarded by 3 to 4 degrees before top dead center, a move intended to blunt peak cylinder pressures and stave off the next catastrophic rod punch-through. Every bulletin read like a confession. EMD's service instructions, issued in rapid succession from late 1985 through 1986, charted a total retreat from the original design. On some lines, entire fleets were derated on paper. Canadian National's SD50 FS were officially listed at 3,300 horsepower. CSX's units were eventually capped at 3,000 by a 2006 service order. And Norfolk Southern's SD40E rebuilds eventually stripped the 645F of its identity altogether. Each reclassification and firmware patch became a line item in a growing ledger of containment, not cure. The cost was measured not just in parts and labor, but in the quiet rewriting of the engine's history. What began as a campaign to outpace General Electric's Dash 7 became an endless cycle of symptom management. As failures mounted and the original engineering promises faded, the drive for root cause gave way to a culture of workaround and redefinition. The official record, softened by technical bulletins and derating memos, buried the scale of the disaster beneath layers of authorized language, leaving the true autopsy for another day.
The physical evidence of the 645F's collapse is not confined to the scrapyard. It is etched into the paper trail of the University of Texas Railroad History Archive, where the cold, statistical reality of EMD's failure is preserved under Shelf Code Box 3, Folder 12. This is the ledger of truth, a digital checksum of a corporate nightmare that was never meant to be read by the public. Inside these folders, the myth of the 25-plus defects per unit is transformed into a signed, witnessed account of systemic industrial failure. Every page represents a brick in the wall of evidence, with defect entries signed by test engineers, shop foremen, and quality assurance officers who knew the engine was doomed before it ever touched the main line. The data strips away the illusion of isolated mechanical incidents, revealing that an average of 26 to 28 faults trailed every single SD50 that left the Grange test floor between 1983 and 1985. These logs are the silent witnesses to a culture of compromise, where safety-critical A-codes for crankcase fractures and main bearing spalling were buried beneath a mountain of production quotas. The paperwork confirms what the railroad suspected but could never prove, that the heavy block units were released with full knowledge of their structural instability. The records show that by late 1985, warranty claims had become a tidal wave, with internal Missouri Pacific memos warning of a systemic fatigue issue that was being handled as a series of unrelated repairs to avoid a total fleet recall. Under the lens of a scanning electron microscope, the fracture face of a failed 645F crankshaft tells a story that no technical bulletin could sanitize. The striations rippling across the steel are a microscopic record of every fatigue cycle endured and lost, tracking the relentless pulse of a 954 revolution per minute operation. At the journal fillet, the microstructure is torn and pitted, showing the unmistakable signs of high cycle fatigue where the elliptical web focused stress into a single fatal point. Metallurgists from the Electromotive Division Lab logged these findings in quiet clinical language. Transgranular cracks, initiation at the web root, and beach marks that provided a forensic signature linking every field failure back to the same design geometry. The imagery archived in the materials vault shows the same pattern across every examined shaft, proving that the crankshaft was not merely a victim of poor maintenance, but a component designed with a finite and dangerously short lifespan. The elliptical web and jigsaw crankcase, once touted as revolutionary improvements to stiffen the block, were revealed to be the very features that concentrated bending moments until the iron simply gave way. The science of the failure was absolute, and by the time the engineers mapped the fracture origins, the damage to EMD's reputation was already irreparable. The official record was eventually closed, not by a triumphant fix, but by a typed memo dated January 1986, stamped confidential and circulated only among the highest tier of management. This kill order ended 645F production with a single devastating line: cease all further SD50 assembly, effective immediately. The minutes from that meeting, later unearthed in the Progress Rail archives, reveal the cold calculus behind the decision. The board realized that the cost of retooling for the next generation, the 710G, was lower than the projected cost of another year of defect claims and warranty repairs for the failed 645F program. There was no public explanation, no press conference to admit the gamble had failed. Instead, there was only a quiet shift in corporate strategy and a massive effort to rebrand the disaster as a necessary step toward progress. The consequences of this silence rippled outward for decades, creating a reliability vacuum that General Electric was more than happy to fill. By 1995, General Electric controlled 55% of the North American high-horsepower locomotive market, a lead built on the wreckage of the SD50. The market share EMD had owned since 1939 was surrendered in the span of a single product cycle, a loss that would eventually lead to the end of their domestic manufacturing. The machine was dead, and as the corporate archives were sealed, the physical artifacts were left to rot in shop bays, their scorched edges serving as the only true ledger of everything that was lost.
Steel fractures. Records vanish. In the void left by EMD's silence, General Electric's flag still flies over American railroads, a dominance 4 decades and counting. The SD50's downfall rewrote the rules of the industry, proving that transparency is not just good engineering, it is the bedrock of corporate survival. When the truth about failure is redacted, the market never forgets who paid the price, and the shadow of the 645F still hangs over every boardroom decision made in the wake of its collapse. On a timeline stretching from the 1984 uprate to Electromotive Division's final North American production in 2014, the arc of decline is unmistakable. Each tick marks another retreat. The 645F's quiet discontinuation, the rise of the 710G, the slow bleed of market confidence, and finally, the end of domestic manufacturing. The forensic trail of scanning electron microscope micrographs, board minutes, and kill memos forms a chain of evidence that no amount of marketing language could ever truly erase. The fracture was not just in the steel of the crankshaft, but in the very corporate identity of a company that once defined the American railroad.
What remains is a record written in metallography and market share, a story of how one engine's failure became the dividing line between dominance and decline. Today, in 2026, the survivors of that era are rare, often rebuilt and derated until they are ghosts of their former selves, haunting short lines and industrial spurs where the original demands of 3,600 horsepower are a distant, dangerous memory. The 710G engine that followed was a magnificent piece of engineering, a corrected and expanded vision that eventually restored some measure of faith, but the momentum had already shifted. General Electric had seized the initiative, using EMD's moment of vulnerability to establish a hegemony that has lasted for generations. The SD50 stands as a cautionary tale of what happens when the pressure to compete overrides the laws of physics and the integrity of the design floor. It is a reminder that in the world of heavy industry, a single decision to push the limits too far can trigger a collapse that takes decades to resolve. Every salvaged part and every archived defect log serves as a testament to a period where the drive for more power, more speed, more market share, blinded the industry to the limits of its own materials. It is important to note that popular historical accounts, including episodes like this one, often compress years of complex struggle into a digestible narrative. In reality, the history was not a series of clean cinematic events, but a messy, painful process involving thousands of people trying to hold a crumbling legacy together. We look at the shredded metal and see an inevitable conclusion, yet for the engineers at Grange in 1984, it was a battle fought in real time, with imperfect information and crushing deadlines. The reality of the SD50 was 1,000 small decisions that converged into a single catastrophic outcome. And while we can map the stress points now, the lived experience was far more nuanced than a single video can capture. This story is not just about a broken engine. It is about the fragility of industrial leadership and the high cost of a single, unyielding corporate mandate. The wreckage of Union Pacific 3806 is more than just scrap. It is a monument to a moment when the pride of an industry was brought low by its own ambition. As the remaining units continue to fade from the tracks, the lessons they left behind remain as hard as the steel they were forged from. Some wreckage, even when buried, casts a shadow that never truly lifts. Tell us in the comments, was the SD50 a necessary failure that paved the way for the 710, or was it the moment EMD truly lost its soul?